Thank you.
Sorry about that. I'm here to talk a little bit about Will Eisner. Many people consider him to be one of the most influential figures in comic books. The reason I'm doing it this week, it is considered to be Will Eisner Week. Will Eisner was born on March 6th, so the first week of March is considered to be Will Eisner Week. And for Will Eisner Week, the message is simple. Read a graphic novel. That's simple. Eisner was born March 6, 1971 in Brooklyn. While growing up, he was picked on, he wasn't very athletic. He was kind of beat up a lot because he was Jewish. While he wasn't a practicing Jew, he was very proud about his heritage. You see that a lot as later in his works. At an early age, he really showed an aptitude for art. He really enjoyed drawing, and this did lead to some paying jobs, some advertising and some pulp books as well. In high school, his friend, Bob Kane, a Batman fan, suggested that he try his hand at cartoons. His first job was working for Wow, What a Magazine Comics, and that's where he met his future business partner, Jerry Iger. Wow only lasted about 4 issues, but Eisner and Iger went on to form their own comic book company. The way it would work is publishers would come to them wanting a different type of character, and Eisner and Iger would come up with the story and the art and pretty much package everything for them and then give it to the publishers to publish. One of the first big hits of theirs was Sheena, Queen of the Jungle. Other notable characters, Black Hawk and Dollman. But the funny thing is, the studio of Eisner and Iger would probably, it became a who's who of comics. People who worked there: Jack Kirby, Bob Kane, Wally Wood, Jules Pfeiffer, and just so many more people who were just from the golden age. In 1939, Eisner and Iger were commissioned to create Wonder Man for Victor Fox. Fox was previously an accountant who worked for DC Comics. He was interested in becoming his own comic book publisher. He pretty much asked Eisner to come up with a blatant ripoff of Superman. Everything from this character's origin to his powers were pretty much Superman knockoff. DC obviously saw this and they sued. Victor Fox had to, pay out a lot of money, and that was the end of Wonder Comics. A lot of this is portrayed in Eisner's semi-biographical book called The Dreamer. Highly recommend it. You really get to see the birth of the golden age of comics in here. Later in 1939, Quality Comics publisher Everett Busy Arnold came to Eisner with an idea of creating a comic book for the Sunday papers. This was an idea that really was never heard of. It was just Sunday strips. Eisner jumped at the chance of creating his own comic book that could be seen by a much wider audience. But this also meant he had to leave the studios of Eisner and Iger. He gladly sold off his shares and came up with probably his most famous creation, The Spirit. Now, in the beginning, this is the first story of The Spirit. The newspaper's publishers saw it and they're like, well, we wanted a superhero. Is he wearing a costume? So as the story goes, Eisner quickly drew a mask on him and said, yeah, that's his costume. And he went to a more traditional look as to what we're used to. The Spirit is pretty much just a guy in a blue suit, but it's what Eisner did with this character that really made a difference. He didn't want the traditional superhero story, guy running around in spandex. Eisner really went for more of a film noir feeling that you could really see in the stories. This wasn't something for little kids. It was going away from your Superman, your Batman, Captain America's. This is more of a film noir type of feeling of the character. And one of the most famous things that Eisner would love to do is he would love to do the splash page, the opening page of every comic. And in it, you can see how he loves to just kind of not blatantly put the word the spirit in there in different types of ways. And that kind of became one of his trademarks. The other thing that he really loved to do is to portray, that film noir feel is he had this thing with rain. He always loved to use the rain a lot. You can see it running down here. You can see it in a couple panels. It was, because he used rain so much, there was a collaborative book later on called Spirit Jam that cartoonist Herbie Kurtzman affectionately called this the Eisner Spritz. It's still something that's referred to today in comics term, the Eisner Spritz. People still refer to that constant rain as an Eisner Spritz. It just became his signature. In 1941, Eisner was drafted into the Army. He hired ghostwriters and artists to help him out in the spirit while he was serving. But this also allowed him to work on a instructional comic book for the Army called Preventive PS or Preventive Maintenance Monthly. In it, Eisner would use, the main character was known as Joe Dope. You get beautiful women in here, but as you can see, it's trying to tell, how to maintain your equipment, how to fill out requisition forms, and here's one on how to strip your M16. On Eisner's return to the studio, he finished the bulk of the Spirit stories, but the Spirit stopped publishing in 1952. Many of these stories would go on to be reprinted later in different formats. They're still being reprinted today. But it was in 1978 where Eisner turned his attention to longer storytelling forms. He ended up creating his most famous called A Contract with God and Other Tenement Stories. The book's short story circles around poor Jewish characters who live in a tenement in New York City. Eisner ended up producing 2 sequels to the book, A Life Force and Dropsy Avenue. And he helped popularize the term graphic novel. He wanted to say this wasn't just, because comic books still had that stigma to the name. So the term was out there, but he's the one who popularized the term graphic novel. Later in his life, you go on to create more graphic novels, new covers for reprints of the Spirit, created graphic novels including Moby Dick, a retelling of Oliver Twist entitled Fagin the Jew, and his last book, The Plot, The Secret Story of the Protocols of the Elder of Zion, which was an account of the making and retribution of the anti-Semite hoax. Eisner was a frequent lecturer about his craft and uses in what he called sequential art. sequential art as in to tell a story with pictures. He taught at the School of Visual Arts in New York City, where he published Will Eisner's Gallery. It was a collection of work by students and he also wrote 2 books based on these lectures, Comics and the Sequential Art, and Graphic Storytelling and the Visual Narrative. They are still used today in teaching students cartooning. Eisner died on January 3rd, 2005 in Lauderdale Lake, Florida, due to complications from a quadruple bypass surgery that was performed in December 22 of 2004. But his legacy lives on. One of the most prestigious awards you can get in the comic industry is the Will Eisner Comic Industry Award, better known as the Eisners. These are held at San Diego Comic-Con every year. Achievements in writing, short stories, art. The Eisners are comics Oscars, for a better word. And to this day, there are still comic creators that come out, new creators, who are still influenced by Eisner's writing and artistic style. You look around, you can really see it. Eisner had a huge impact in visual storytelling, and his works speak for themselves. Just want to say many thanks to Will Eisner Studios, especially to Danny Fingerworth for helping me out with this presentation. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Why do you think he isn't more popular and the Spirit isn't more popular? Is it just because he wasn't published by one of the big 2?
He was published. A lot of his stories were reprinted by DC Comics for a while. There was a TV movie based on the Spirit, starring Sam Jones of Flash Gordon fame, and there was also a feature film that was directed by his friend Frank Miller, which a lot of people, yeah. There is a book out there, Eisner Miller, where you read it and you think Miller gets it, but to his, defense, he is not a filmmaker. Everything he knew, he learned from Robert Rodriguez and Zack Snyder from their visual interpretations of his work. As for the popularity, it's really hard to say why something is popular and why it isn't. There is a cult following with Eisner. As for the popularity, they have tried to put out products, but I've been to Toy Fair many times and I've seen products that never hit the shelves, and if there's no interest, nobody's going to buy it, unfortunately. I know there's also out there on the internet, if you do some researching, Incredibles director Brad Bird was a huge fan of the Spirit, and there are some test animation cells of a possible Spirit animated film that never got made.
Thank you. What'd you think of the Darwin Cook reboot from?
I thought it was incredible. I actually did get a chance to speak to Darwin over at Baltimore Comic-Con as he was putting out. We kind of discussed the fact about Frank Miller leaving out, Ebony White, and Ebony White is one of these characters who was a product of the time, very stereotypical African American. Eisner wasn't the only one doing these type of characters. You can also see them in Disney, Warner Brothers. Eisner did apologize, but Cook did a great job adapting stories, especially, the way he adapted Sans Serif was pretty much almost to the T, just with a modern touch to it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
I was just wondering about the typeface of Will Eisner. It's strikes me as very Disney-ish.
A lot of people make that comparison. Some reason they just had similar signatures, and
So it's just a coincidence.
it's just a coincidence. There are, as I was doing research for this, there are like pages and pages dedicated to trying to analyze that, and it's just nobody can seem to find the connection. It's just a coincidence that just have similar like
So that's-
font styles.
So that's his invention, I guess.
But yes.
So today you said there's a lot of, I know a lot of writers are influenced by him. Who would you say would be the spiritual successor? Like the continue carrying the torch?
These days, I'm not too sure. For the longest time, obviously, it was Darwin Cook.
Right.
These days, I'm not too sure. I mean, I see a little in, some of Brian Bendis' style when he does more down to earth like Powers and his Daredevil run. Yeah, definitely you can see it in there. Scott Snyder on aspects of his Batman run, you can see it.
About like a Brubaker.
Brubaker, I mean, he definitely, Brubaker was influenced, but Brubaker's moved beyond Eisner. He's more into the pulp feeling of things, and Eisner's kind of, well, Eisner does film noir, pulp and film
Kind of
noir.
stop short.
Yeah.
Okay.
But in terms of visual, I mean, all you have to do is pick up a comic and look around, and everybody, I mean, the slide I showed you with the way he does the spirit, there are still people who do that type of sneaking in the lettering into their artistry every day. It's just, it seems to be something a lot of people like to do now.
It is a fad now.
Yeah.
I read one last week. I had it all the words in like leaves and smoke.
Yeah.
I'm like, all right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.